Welcome to this YouTube version of my presentation, Rings of Fire, How the Brain Makes Consciousness, delivered at the 2023 Science of Consciousness Conference in Taormina, Italy. In this exploration, I propose a theory elucidating the origins of felt qualia, our subjective sensory experiences.
The phenomenon of vision is a truly remarkable phenomenon. We simply open our eyes, and there's the world in full 3D and color. And if we look around in different directions, we see the world in different directions. The world appears where we point our eyes. The visual world appears as a surrounding spatial structure, complete with an image of ourselves viewing it. So there are two aspects to visual perception. There's the direct experience of colors seen on colored surfaces that are exposed to direct view, but there's also an invisible structural framework on which those colored surfaces are perceived to exist. If this is our viewpoint, the side of the tomato exposed to view appears as a modal surface percept, but the rest of the tomato appears as an invisible amodal volume percept.
I wanted to illustrate something here, which is that each of the colored pixels of the visual field had to come to the eye via particular vector direction paths, and then the brain has to cast each pixel back out to the proper depth to reconstitute an accurate 3D isometric model of the tomato.
Direct perception, or naive realism, is our natural, intuitive understanding of vision, that we see the world around us as the world itself. Indirect perception, or representationalism, suggests that the world we see around us is a perceptual replica of that world in an internal representation. This is a profound philosophical dichotomy, and it's central to the understanding of the principles of vision. And this issue, incredibly, remains unresolved to this day.
In this video, I take a representational approach to consciousness. That is to say, every experience you've ever had is a result of your brain's activity, leading us to the undeniable conclusion that our brains are the printers of our consciousness. The model that we construct of the physical world might align accurately with reality, or it could be skewed, for example, larger and inverted, the way that it often appears in the cortex. For example, imagine the blue man believing he comprehends the physical world's location, when in reality it's represented by the gray figure depicted on the right. However, it's more likely that our perception is incommensurable or unmappable to the physical world in terms of scale, rotation, or location. This is akin to the impossibility of finding a direct geographical correspondence between the Middle Earth of the Lord of the Rings saga and our actual Earth. Once we assume a representational approach to consciousness, we have this gradient going all the way from matter up to consciousness, and we can look at any aspect along the way. I will focus mostly on the first-person observations of the underliers of consciousness, which is known as a phenomenological approach, but I will also consider the more traditionally scientific approach of looking at the overliers of matter, known as reductionist or materialist. In this model, the black box of mechanism represents the intricate 3D meaning that is encoded by the brain and subsequently utilized to govern its reactions and perform better in the future. In essence, the brain projects our experiences not as tangible entities, but as functional meanings. These meanings serve as a live 3D dashboard to orchestrate the body's operations in the future. And I would say also that this dashboard lags reality by 100 to 200 milliseconds. So in general, it's serving as a memory mechanism to better guide future action. With evolution of language and vocal apparatus beyond what we currently have, we could possibly transmit explicit 3D holographic video meaning in real time in our language, thereby reducing ambiguity and enhancing clarity of communication without having to rely on other people's subjective or variable priors. In other words, right now I can say the word cube and you have a 3D understanding of what that is, but if we had a more advanced language, perhaps I could say a more complex word that would give you an exact meaning of a room with all the contents and their particular arrangement and all that kind of thing. I argue that the things you perceive, including yourself and the objects around you, are the phenomenal realm, a 3D meaning understood and used by the brain. The physical world also exists, but it's not directly observable. So that would be like Plato's analogy of the cave, Descartes' projection, living in the matrix. Meaning space then would be incommensurable with actual space. Your entire world of experience is reducible in the first stage to a scaffolding of rings. In other words, a zero-dimensional point tracer moves around through perceptual space, usually in rings, still in this meaning space, and off of that, the whole entire 3D video kind of fits or is triggered or is aligned thereby. We must go one level deeper than the rings to the neural patterns encoding those rings, and then the schemas to observe something tangible in the physical realm's actual space. So in my view, it's kind of this serial construction that bit by bit of time is used to have a particular location in perceptual space and use that progression of movement through perceptual space with passage of time to encode meaning of space and things that you want to pay attention to. I have subjectively experienced each of the components that I will be discussing. In other words, rings, bank, flow, throw, vibes, story, paint, and we'll get to all of those later. Not only one time, but multiple times. Even as a skeptic, the experiences I've had were compelling enough to convince me that each qualia, even though it seems disparate, like the feeling of cold or the smell of a cigarette, they all share a common denominator. The process can be likened to slowing down a song. For example, if we play the song Crystal Ball and the vocals is giving vibrato, if we slow it down, we can note that they actually used an artificial auto-tune to create the vibrato. It wasn't naturally sung, in the song. So you can deduce how these seemingly smooth elements are created from, by slowing things down and looking at what components are actually going into giving us the feeling of things, like the feeling of, again, smelling a mango or dipping your foot in cold water. Other people have observed and noticed pretty much most all of the things that I'm talking about, although I think that I'm going into kind of trying to place them in more specific terms, but other people have noticed a lot of these things. Immanuel Kant was one person that posited a distinction between the physical realm and the perceptual realm, or as he called them, the noumenal and the phenomenal realms. In other words, we can't directly observe the physical, but we can observe the phenomena that our brain are created. And arguments for this also include the idea that consciousness lags reality by 100 to 300 milliseconds. Our blind spot in our eye is filled in. It isn't actually there. We have a colored experience, whereas the actual world only emits frequencies. It doesn't necessarily emit colors per se. And anesthesia knocks our experience out, but it doesn't knock out the physical world. Christoph Koch, Bernard Bars, David Eagleman have done research showing that incoming stimuli seem to be processed in 100 millisecond temporal chunks. Also, the number 25 milliseconds, roughly, looks somewhat interesting and important. Badley proposed a 3D visual spatial sketchpad, or what I call the bank, which carries attention and prints frames of explicit 2D and 3D shape in the real world and imagination schemas and records new shapes. According to Badley and Turvey, each moment of consciousness doesn't just look at its 100 milliseconds, it looks at a full second of a flowing time window and extrapolates a full 3D movie as existing between the frames, just as we do in 2D when we're watching movies made of discrete photos. You could also think of this as working memory, or one component thereof. My proposal is that attention, that is subliminal translucent shape, frames vary dynamically from 2 to 1,000 hertz and can walk around within the real-world schema or the imagination schema as attention is transiently moved from one thing to another, mostly subliminally. My proposal also is that in a single attention frame of consciousness, a zero-dimensional point follows a path, the perimeter of the frame, to form a ring or a square or whatever kind of shape outline contributing to the coherence of consciousness. Also, I propose that these rings serve as a usually invisible scaffolding to encode and decode complex neural frequency patterns associated with spatial and temporal locations. Hawkins speaks of a hierarchical static sequence prediction in the cortex. That's Jeff Hawkins, who wrote On Intelligence and Thousand Brains Theory of Intelligence, I think is the other book. Rodolfo Linhaus speaks of 2 to 12 hertz rhythms generated by the inferior olive and thalamocortical consciousness. Stephen Lahar and Gestalt theory argue many of the points of this model. I propose that the most fundamental division of consciousness is between context, which I consider to be 2 to 12 hertz plus, sometimes up to 1,000 hertz, isometric shape, and the other division being content, 40 to 80 hertz plus, and this is your theta phi visual field. Okay, so this is kind of a very novel way of looking at it. So see if you can get your head around it. So basically the idea is that we're able to have explicit understanding of 3D isometric shape, which can't really exist in a perspective image such as what we have on the retina. So it's as though the brain has to create the isometric shape by casting each pixel back out the proper distance to reconstitute a 3D shape. Once it has that shape, it saves it to the bank. This is the bank down here at the bottom left. And then you can rotate and scale and translate this whole bank structure within the real world schema or within the imagination schema to give explicit 3D understanding of an object. For example, you know what a dog is no matter how far away it is from you, what orientation, if it's lying on its back, any of these things, you still understand it because you have understanding of the shape. And the same thing for like the dog house. Even if it was flipped over, you would still understand it. So this is the isometric shape understanding, and I argue that it also carries the feeling of qualia by varying and patterning the transient changes in frequency. Then you also have the content, and a lot of times we like to think of the visual field as just a fronto-parallel plane with rows and columns of pixels. But it's really more geometrically accurate if we think about it just as how a pinhole camera captures an image. The entire image can actually be right there at a zero-dimensional point where the rays invert. And the reason for that is because each ray of light has its own unique vector orientation in 3D space, and that's going to carry the pixel location information, and also each specific ray of light has a particular frequency and amplitude that's going to carry the frequency or the color of the light. So the idea is that, when the image is inverted back here, the actual ray orientations aren't inverting. So you don't have to flip this photo back over to reconstitute it. All you have to do is start with the vectors and provide a specific depth or distance for each of those rays, and then you can reconstitute isometric 3D shape from the perspective warp retinal image. If we consider a hallway as being an isometric model built by the brain, and in particular via the bank, the far end of the perceptual hallway will still take up less theta, that is this angle here of these two light rays from the perspective vantage. they take up less visual field than the front end. So the back end takes up 5 degrees of theta, the front end takes up 20 degrees of theta to this observer at this location. But if you cast each ray back to the proper distance, you still have that this is 8 feet here and 8 feet wide at the back. And further, you can link a specific voxel on this hallway, like right here, to a specific pixel vector direction to have a full 2D and 3D understanding of consciousness. Of course, over to the left is what the girl sees. The perspective warp makes the far end of the hall smaller, apparently, to the 2D retinal perspective image. Again, this is the bank structure. It's a perceptual structure, and it consists of 2D and 3D isometric shapes and can transiently shape align to things in the real world schema or imagination schema, and also location align, in other words, move around, translate. It's the storage and print head of shape and artificial similarity understanding. Also guides the when and static and sequential memory of perception. Like I said, it can scale, rotate, and translate within either schema. It's correlated probably with the ventral visual stream. In particular, it seems like lateral occipital cortex, fusiform gyrus, inferior temporal lobe look promising. I would also say entorhinal cortex might be possible. It can be used for visual working memory, mental rotation, mental transformation, mental simulation. It brings conscious focus to a particular location, whether in the real world or the imagination. This is my 2022 understanding, and you've got this cycle that starts with a zero-dimensional point or tracer or 3D cursor that moves around according to some specified path specified by the bank. While the bank and the ring stay mostly fixed, there's spatial offset created by a sort of wind. As soon as things are being printed, that which is printed is beginning to be blown normal usually to the path of the rings. If you experience some kind of force, like someone turns a car left while you're driving, you're going to feel like you're thrown to the right, and the rings can encode this feeling by actually moving over more to the right to print out the feeling of that throw or that inertial force. Sound would vibrate the rings in real time, in other words, the present tense drawing of the ring, not the stuff that's already been printed and left behind that just stays fixed at whatever node it was printed at. And these rings print out story, which is your imagination, and they also align with the 3D understanding of the real world schema. My 2023 understanding is that it's possible to be a little bit more precise. So first, let's break down into this dichotomy. Let's specify that there's brain information that pertains to the real world, whether that's the environment or your body, and there's brain information that pertains to imagination. And I think that's pretty much it. And then you can understand this information in two different ways. As isometric 3D shape, which is provided by the bank, or as perspective 2D, which is vector provided, or it's the retinotopy understanding extracted from the visual cortex. A set of pixel vectors is connected to proper voxels in each cycle of context consciousness, taking a ring path. Normal to the rings, future is depicted in one direction, past gradient is depicted in the other, and as you go into the future or the past, the opacity fades. And as it's continually flowing in real time, it creates a 1 second flowing time window. Here, to give my understanding of how the hippocampus may work, I provided an example that when I was staying at my hotel, which was Hotel Velo Doro in Taormina, there was a call box that you had to press, and then someone on another floor would open the door, and that's how you would get in. And it triggered a memory of my grandfather's house, who was a doctor and had a home office, and there was also a call box where you could press and talk. And so it kind of illustrates really well how I think the hippocampus works. So the first step is this dentate gyrus, where you have pattern separation or feature extraction, and you're looking for any and all unique aspects of current experience. In this case, it was press to open. You know, you press something and you get the door open or whatever. CA3 in the hippocampus is auto-association, so it's going to dig up all the memories that share that particular feature. In this case, you know, it would be a list of things that were pressed to open. This list is a skewer, that's my word for it. And then finally, CA1 is pattern completion. In other words, it selects the most salient or useful or applicable memory from that list and replays 0.1 seconds of it, probably by reaching back into the cortex to reactivate certain pathways. And in this case, it selected the memory of my grandfather's house, who had the press to call button on the outside of his house, and just replayed just a very short snippet of it to give me, oh yeah, that's that, you know, give me understanding of the thing. I think that the brain actually uses 3D perceptual space for a lot of its computations and processes. So for memory, I think there is a literal usage of the bank to layer recalled memories by order in which they occurred. In other words, the most recent memory will appear located on the top layer. In this case, we have a skewer by the letter B. It could actually have a shape, or it could just be an artificial similarity where you just have a single line going through. But each layer deeper is representing earlier memories of particular things, such as writing the letter B in this case. All the way down to the center would be like your childhood memories of first learning to write that letter. And obviously this would be subliminal, mostly translucent, mostly not really that noticeable. But just as imagination uses space to help give you understanding, I argue that memory also uses the bank and uses space to help encode time. So Christoph Koch, who together with Francis Crick, I think co-discovered DNA, Christoph Koch has argued that frames of consciousness occur at roughly 10 hertz, in other words, 100 milliseconds. I would argue that it may actually be variable from 2 hertz all the way to 1,000 hertz. Obviously, when it's much higher frequency, like 500 to 1,000, it's going to be probably very hard to observe with current techniques of EEG. But when Christoph Koch speaks of frames of consciousness, I don't know if he means 3D or 2D. And if he means 2D, does he mean just fronto-parallel frames? So I don't know what he means, but in terms of my model, I say that these frames can be any of the above. They can be 3-dimensional, 2-dimensional, 1-dimensional. It's all just kind of varies by what the brain wants to do and how currently overloaded it may be. But I would also say that these frames, especially when they're 2D, they don't have to exist only at the fronto-parallel plane. They can actually walk around and 3D rotate within perceptual space, the space around you. And in fact, I think it's important for there to be offset between a new frame and an old frame, because otherwise you'd have muddiness in the working memory or in the time window. So 3 mechanisms to offset the frames would then be walk, which is where you actually just walk your attention from one thing to another within real world or imagination, depicted here as the girl shifting her attention from her phone to her body posture, back to her phone. It's very subliminal. It's like this whole process might be 1 second long and involve only 10 frames, like 2 or 3 here at the phone, 1 in the air, 1 or 2 at her torso, 1 in the air, 1 or 2 back on the phone. Very transient, very subliminal, but happening all the time. That's walk. Also, you have the concept of self-motion as you are walking down a trail or hiking down a trail. The old frames are naturally left offset, at least within the real-world schema, or the environment schema, I should say. And then finally, you can have this artificial kick-out such as if you are stationary and or the frame rate is high, like you're listening to music and paying attention to it, then the old frames need to be artificially moved away at some velocity and direction within this working memory and this fusing schema, if you will. Again, here's the walk of attention from phone to torso, back to phone. Here, old frames are glued to the environment schema, which is constantly moving, flowing in that backwards direction relative to the person. When you go for a hike, I think within consciousness, you don't really move. It's printing that the world is flowing through your kind of window. Artificial kickout is depicted here. In this case, the two-dimensional ring frames kind of glue the whole 3D scene to it. So when you kick out these old rings, the whole 3D scene, kind of goes with it. And as depicted here, the further in the past it is, it's fading into nothing. And again, each cycle of consciousness could be like about 100 milliseconds. In review, at any given moment, say within a 100 millisecond time frame, your attention is likely focused on a single object or concept, either within the real world schema or imagination. This object or concept usually has some shape. This theory suggests that the shape is represented by first tracing its outline at the current focus of attention. This is the concept of the rings mentioned earlier. That's the most incipient thing within each cycle of consciousness. It can then flesh out the surface, and generally we only notice the kind of 3D video in between all the frames. Sound, just as in sound such as in music, requires a much higher sampling rate in consciousness, about 1,000 times rate possibly, just as with videography, in which the image is shot at 24 frames a second, but the audio is captured at 48,000 samples a second. Suggests that music instigates the formation of rings at a much faster pace, possibly as fast as 1 ring per millisecond. Similarly, experienced qualia also seem to instigate a pattern of high-frequency ring formation. In other words, the feeling of dipping your foot in cold water is going to transiently increase the frame rate, and not only increase it, but have a particular pattern of frequency that it uses that's dedicated to that qualia. In all these examples, you might find it more useful to envision the context frames as almost planar structures, like the surface of a face, rather than just rings. While the concept of rings seems more foundational, within each cycle it's possible to represent a full surface such as a face. A useful way to conceptualize consciousness is by imagining a bank at the center printing shape frames. Your eyes observe from a specific viewpoint, while your mind's eye often observes from a different viewpoint, perceiving the imagination schema, pixels and voxels connected by the rings from this alternate viewpoint. The mind's eye is continually changing perspective, zooming in and out, and orbiting around. One can quickly shift the focus of the bank shape between the two viewpoints. In other words, you can go from one frame of real-world schema to throw in a frame of imagination schema, and then back to the real-world schema, passing that quickly. Also, you may notice that there are times when you've zoned out. For example, when driving a long ways, you may notice, oh, I was thinking about something else, and then you come back to yourself, and it's like, where were you? And you're immersed in your imagination schema, which is largely subliminal. It's giving you information of what, but it's very hard to observe the visual form of it. This shows you possible locations of various schemas. The pixel information seems to be carried by the dorsal stream, which is vectors and their orientation in 3D space. It's your 2D retinal image, so to speak. And then 3D isometric understanding is carried by this ventral path. And you have the hippocampus here. You also have the thalamus at the center of the brain, which communicates with the whole cortex. And as such, it would be a good location for the alignment tracer, which is tracing out rings in this fusing schema and providing a flowing time window. The imagination schema would be carried probably largely by the prefrontal cortex, although with help from the ventral and possibly the dorsal visual stream. The body schema would definitely be carried by the somatosensory cortex. Environment schema is just part of the real world schema that's around you. Bank schema likely in the entorhinal cortex and or lateral occipital cortex, fusiform gyrus, inferior temporal lobe. May also have some in the prefrontal cortex, posterior parietal cortex distributed. You also have this concept of movement, which is the motor cortex, and it's going to have temporal alignment of motor command to the ring tracer of the fusing schema. It may also include the premotor cortex, the basal ganglia, which seems to affect the speed at which you do some action and through which actions have to pass first before they get approved. So if rats are given ketamine, which is an NMDA antagonist, NMDA is the glutamate receptor. It's the most largely used neurotransmitter of the cortex. So when you give this, their spike train of action potentials goes from somewhat smooth to very bunched up. So each cycle of their consciousness, I propose, is bunched up in time, leaving these big gaps between each frame of consciousness. And when you introduce gaps in consciousness, it makes it easier to pay attention to exactly what's going on in each cycle or each frame of consciousness. You can more clearly see these rings because they're a lot more planar. They're less like a helix, and this is the flow or the offset that's going normal. And so when you bunch it up, you trace the ring out more quickly, and you get more of a planar slice through the world. You can more clearly see what the brain is doing as it constructs consciousness. This shows you the same concept with a little bit of the 3D view. You can see this helix better here and how it gets bunched up into these more planar rings for each cycle of consciousness. This here is the study that actually shows that this happens. In particular, they're looking at the retrosplenial cortex, which is behind the hippocampus. And as you see, the spike trains went from smooth to very bunched up. And they also became, in this case, dissociated with the somatosensory cortex. In other words, when you have a gap in the frames of the retrosplenial cortex, you have greatest intensity of action in the somatosensory cortex. This may be why certain NMDA antagonists at certain levels cause a feeling of dissociation. The four key neurotransmitter systems are acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. And this chart here with paid use shows you very clearly where these particular nuclei are projecting to and sending these neurotransmitters that they provide to the brain for levels modulation. This chart shows you what things would cause NMDA antagonism or GABA agonism, which may be kind of the same thing as far as phenomenologically. As you can see, things like alcohol, barbiturates, phenibut. Also on this line would be fly agaric, mushroom, nitrous oxide, ketamine, THC. You also have 5-HT agonists represented here. And the 5-HT agonists seem to increase your imagination, possibly, from what I've heard. NMDA antagonists seem to possibly decrease the vectors of the visual field so that you can more clearly see the imagination schema and the frames of consciousness. Again, the bunching up that I noticed with ketamine, or not noticed, but talked about with that article on ketamine. So this is just kind of an interesting table showing those things. For more information, you can watch this 6-hour course on YouTube that I created entitled Perceptual Optics. It looks first at light from emission to capture, and then it looks at going from 2D to 3D, the necessity of having a bank structure, frames of consciousness, the various schemas, including real-world schema, imagination schema, bank schema, fusing schema, and it finally looks at memory systems. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you there.